The call came in on the morning of February 10th, 1979, and from the first sentence, something was wrong. A man on the line told the Riverside County Sheriff's dispatcher he had found a body on Highway 243 in the San Jacinto Mountains east of Banning. He said it was on the side of the road. He said it was partially covered in snow. And when the dispatcher tried to get details, basic details, the kind any witness would naturally provide, the man on the other end grew argumentative. He said he couldn't even tell if the person was male or female. Deputies racing up that mountain highway would later use a specific word to describe the call. Not frightened. Not shaken. Not the voice of a man who had stumbled onto something that shook him to his core. They called him argumentative. What investigators would not know for another 45 years is that they weren't just talking to a witness. They were talking to the killer, a man who had murdered a 17-year-old girl, driven to a stretch of mountain road, left her body in the snow, and then calmly picked up a phone to report what he had done. He passed a polygraph test 5 days later. He walked out of the sheriff's station and lived a full life for 35 more years. He died in Florida in 2014, convinced he had taken his secret to the grave. He was wrong. But before we get to what finally caught him, you first have to understand who Esther Gonzalez was, and how a single piece of evidence, collected in the cold on that February morning, waited 45 years to speak. Beaumont, California in the late 1970s sat tucked into the San Gorgonio Pass between the San Bernardino Mountains to the north and the San Jacintos to the south. A small working city of close-set neighborhoods, church communities, and the kind of steady, ordinary life where everyone's roots ran deep and everyone's name was already known. The pass funneled wind and highway traffic between the desert and the Los Angeles basin, but Beaumont itself was quiet. The kind of place where a 17-year-old girl could walk from her parents' house to her sister's without a second thought. Esther Gonzalez was the fourth of 7 children. Her family was large, warm, and close, the kind of family that spread across a small town the way families do when they stay, when the children grow up and marry and settle a few streets over rather than leaving. Her father and mother anchored the household. Her older sister Elizabeth had a home in nearby Banning, barely a few miles away across the pass. Her brother Eddie had gone to the same high school as most of the boys in the neighborhood. At 17, Esther was a high school senior. She was at that particular age when everything feels like a threshold, when graduation is close enough to taste, and the life on the other side of it feels full of possibility. Neighbors who knew her described her the way people describe someone who made the ordinary feel warm. She was present. She was cheerful. She was the kind of girl who said goodbye properly before she left. On the afternoon of Friday, February 9th, 1979, that was exactly what she did. She said her goodbyes to her parents in Beaumont, stepped out the front door, and started walking toward her sister Elizabeth's home in Banning. It was a familiar walk. A short distance between 2 points of family and comfort. She never arrived. As the hours passed that Friday evening, Elizabeth Gonzalez waited. Phone calls were made. Friends were contacted. Word spread through the family the way bad news spreads. Fast, then faster, then arriving all at once in the form of a certainty no one wanted to say aloud. By the time her parents had spent a sleepless night, the answer had already happened somewhere out in the dark between Beaumont and Banning. The next morning, February 10th, a man named Luis Randolph Williamson, known to everyone as Randy, was driving along Highway 243, the winding mountain road that climbs through pine and canyon between Banning and the resort town of Idlewild. He pulled over near an area called Poppet Flats, He said he had spotted something against the snowbank on the side of the road. It was a body. He found a phone. He called the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Banning. And then the call went wrong. Deputies would reach Esther within the hour. She was 17 years old, partially covered in snow, on a mountain road she had no reason to be on, miles from the walk she had set out to take the day before. The cold had preserved the scene. The signs of violence were unmistakable. An autopsy would later confirm that Esther Gonzalez had been raped, beaten, and bludgeoned to death. She had been the fourth of 7 children in a family that had never been given a reason to fear the walk between two towns. That morning, a knock on the door in Beaumont ended their world. Elizabeth would say decades later that the guilt never fully left her. In an interview, she said quietly, "Sometimes I wish I would have followed her. If I'd known that was going to happen, I would have followed her." Her brother Eddie, when he learned who the investigators were looking at in the first days, felt the particular vertigo of a small town struck by violence, because he had gone to high school with the man who found his sister's body. All eyes turned to Randy Williamson from the moment the deputies arrived on Highway 243. The person who finds the body is always a person of interest. That is a standard of any investigation. But Williamson was more than that. His behavior from the very first phone call had raised something investigators couldn't name but couldn't dismiss. He was argumentative with the dispatcher when he should have been frightened. He claimed he couldn't tell if the body was male or female, a strange thing to say and a stranger thing to hold to. He was calm at the scene in a way that didn't sit right. Detective investigators with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department formally identified him as the caller 5 days after Esther's body was found, and brought him in for a full interview. The 1970s were the era before DINA, before digital databases, before the forensic tools that would eventually rewrite what a cold case investigation could do. What law enforcement had in 1979 was intuition, interrogation, and one technology that was considered, at the time, close to definitive: the polygraph, the lie detector. Williamson was asked if he would take one. He agreed. He sat in the chair, submitted to the censors, and answered the questions put to him about his involvement in the death of Esther Gonzalez. He passed. In 1979, that result carried weight that is difficult to overstate. While it was not legally admissible as proof of innocence, it functioned as one in practice. In the absence of any other hard evidence, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, nothing placing him with Esther before her death, the polygraph became the wall between suspicion and action. Investigators had no choice. Their primary lead collapsed. Randy Williamson walked out of that sheriff's station a free man, having looked his accusers in the eye and, in the language of the technology they trusted most, told the truth. What investigators would learn only decades later was that polygraphs do not detect lies. They detect anxiety. A calm person, or a practiced one, can pass. Williamson had been calm from the beginning. The case went into the files. The investigation continued for a period, then slowed, then stopped finding new ground. By the early 1980s, the murder of Esther Gonzalez had become what the system calls a cold case, a term that sanitizes the raw, ongoing grief of a family that has no answer and no end. The case file, thick with reports and the one-page polygraph result that had sent everything sideways, was eventually moved to storage. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Esther. Randy Williamson, for his part, lived his life. A U.S. Marine Corps veteran, he eventually left California altogether, relocating to Florida, thousands of miles from the snowbank on Highway 243. He settled there. He lived for another 35 years after February 10, 1979. He died in Florida in 2014, a full decade before his name would surface again. But while Williamson lived and died and took his secret south, one thing remained behind. A small biological sample, collected from Esther's body at the scene, had been carefully stored by the original investigators. In 1979, that sample was evidence without a language, something that held the truth, but that science had not yet learned to read. Through the 1980s and 1990s, as DNA analysis emerged and transformed criminal justice, investigators created a profile from that preserved sample and ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database. No match returned. Williamson had never been convicted of a crime requiring his DNA to enter the system. The profile sat in the database, a digital signature without a name, and waited. By 2023, 44 years had passed since Esther Gonzalez walked out her parents' front door. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team, a joint task force assembled specifically to reopen cases that older technology had failed, decided to give her case another look. The tool they were bringing to it had not existed in 1979, or 1989, or even 1999. It had only become usable for cold case work in the years since, and it had already rewritten what justice could reach back and claim. Forensic genetic genealogy works like this. Investigators take an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene and upload it to public ancestry databases, the same websites ordinary people use to trace their family history. When the profile finds a partial match, even a distant cousin several generations removed, trained genealogists begin building family trees. They work outward from that match through public records, tracing lineages forward and backward through generations, looking for a candidate who matches the geography and timeline of the crime. It is painstaking work, measured in weeks and months rather than hours. But it has a reach that no previous technology has matched. The Riverside County team pulled the decades-old evidence from storage and sent the preserved semen sample to a private laboratory in Texas called Othram, which specialized in extracting and sequencing badly degraded biological material. The scientists at Othram faced a genuine challenge. 45-year-old evidence does not surrender its secrets easily. They extracted what remained, sequenced it with advanced techniques, and built a comprehensive DNA profile of the unknown man who had killed Esther Gonzalez in the winter of 1979. The profile was uploaded to genealogical databases. The search began. A hit came back. Not a direct match. A distant relative. Someone who had submitted their own DNA to an ancestry platform and made it publicly searchable. The genealogists began building the family tree outward from that partial connection, tracing cousins and second cousins and parents of parents through public records, obituaries, property filings, marriage licenses. The trail moved slowly and then, with the precision that comes from narrowing a field of names to a geography, it arrived somewhere specific. They identified a woman who had lived and died in Beaumont, California, the same small city where Esther Gonzalez's parents had lived. The same community where Esther had grown up. The genealogists found a newspaper obituary for the woman. It listed the name of her son, the executor of her estate, Lewis Randolph Williamson. The investigators would later describe the moment of recognition as a jolt. The name wasn't new. It was right there in the original case file from 1979, on the first page of the first report, The name of the man who had called in the body, who had sat in the interview room, who had passed the polygraph test, and who had walked out into 35 more years of living. For 45 years, the first person they suspected had been the right person. A single flawed piece of technology had been enough to put them off the trail. But a genealogical link is not proof. To close the case, they needed a direct comparison, Williamson's own DNA against the sample from Esther's body. And Williamson had been dead for a decade. Investigators began working a different angle. They looked into the circumstances of Williamson's death in Florida in 2014. He had died in Brevard County. An autopsy had been performed, and standard autopsy procedure requires the collection of biological samples. The question was whether those samples had survived a routine storage purge in the decades since. The Riverside County team reached out to the Brevard County Sheriff's Office in Florida and explained what they were trying to do. They had a 45-year-old murder. They had a genealogical match pointing to a man now dead. They needed whatever biology might remain from his 2014 autopsy. It was a long shot. Evidence from a routine death investigation a decade old had no obvious reason to be preserved. The Brevard County Sheriff's Office came back with an answer. They still had a blood sample from Williamson's 2014 autopsy, held in storage. That small forgotten vial, drawn in a Florida examination room from the body of a man who believed he had escaped, was shipped across the country to the California Department of Justice Forensic Laboratory. Scientists there created a DNA profile from Williamson's blood and set it against the profile extracted from the evidence collected on Highway 243 in February of 1979. The result was unambiguous. The DNA matched. Louis Randolph Williamson, the man who had called in the body, who had sat calm in the interview room, who had passed the polygraph and moved to Florida and lived 35 more years, was the man who had raped and murdered Esther Gonzalez. On November 20th, 2024, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office announced to the world that the case was solved. The man who found the body had been the killer. The first person they ever suspected had been the right answer all along. For the Gonzalez family, the news arrived 45 years after the knock on the door in Beaumont. Elizabeth Gonzalez, the sister whose home Esther had been walking to, gave a written statement. She said the family was very happy to finally have closure. And then she said the harder thing. She was a little sad that he would not spend any time in prison for what he had done. He had died a free man. He had escaped the courtroom. He had lived out his years in Florida without ever being called to account in any room where it counted legally. Her brother Eddie, who had gone to high school with Williamson in the years before Esther was born, told reporters he was very surprised. He said he didn't think Williamson had been capable of it. That was the particular cruelty of a killer who lived comfortably in a community. He was the neighbor you trusted, the classmate you remembered, the face you didn't look twice at, because there was no reason to. The case closes on a bittersweet accounting. Justice came, but not in the form the family deserved. Not a verdict, not a sentence, not a moment in which the man faced consequences in public, in daylight, with Esther's name spoken aloud by a judge. What the family received instead was the truth. A name. A confirmed answer to a question that had been open for nearly half a century. And the knowledge that the investigators who had worked the original case in 1979, who had collected that small biological sample and logged it and stored it carefully even when they had no way to use it, those investigators had, without knowing it, kept the case alive. Without that preserved evidence, the truth would have died with Williamson in Florida in 2014. With it, the science of a future they never anticipated was able to reach back across 45 years, trace a family tree through an ancestry database, find a forgotten vial of blood in a Florida evidence room, and deliver the name that had always been right there on page 1 of the file. Esther Gonzalez was 17 years old. She was the fourth of 7 children in a family rooted in the pass between the mountains. She was a high school senior who said her goodbyes properly and set out on a walk she had made 100 times before. She was killed on a winter afternoon by a man who then drove to a mountain road, left her in the snow, and called the police himself. A man cold enough to sit calm while investigators asked him questions. Cold enough to pass a machine designed to find guilt. Cold enough to live a full life on the other side of it. The machine failed. The science didn't. What does it say about the limits of our certainty, in any era, that a technology trusted enough to close a murder investigation could be defeated by a calm enough liar? How many other cases from the 1970s and 1980s carry a polygraph result in the file that may have pointed investigators away from the truth rather than toward it? And for the Gonzalez family, 45 years of carrying the open question of who had done this, what does it mean that closure arrived in the form of a name attached to a man already gone? A truth without a reckoning. Justice found Esther Gonzalez after 45 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.